Welcome back to another episode of TINAH Talks. I'm your host, Kelsey, and today I have a guest, Crystal, and we're talking all about bullying and how it affects our mental health. Bullying, how it happens when we're kids, and then how maybe it happens as adults, and then how everything is intertwined and what we have to deal with in the future from it. So, welcome to the podcast, Crystal. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. Thank you so much. And thank you so much for having me. I am so excited to chat with you about this very important topic that affects pretty much everybody or has affected at one point everybody. So, this is
Yeah.
really important stuff that we're talking about today.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I'm pumped to have you here and to dive into it. And before we get started, why don't you just tell the listeners a little bit about you, where you're at, and what you do for your business?
Absolutely, I'd love to. I'm Crystal T. I am a licensed therapist and parenting expert. I've been supporting families in my private practice for the last decade or so, which is crazy that I'm that old, apparently, that I have a decade of experience. In 2020, just before kind of the world turned upside down with COVID, I decided to take my practice online to reach parents who needed support from that end. And it's just been such a rewarding journey. I'm really proud of this number, but I've helped over 185 families reconnect with their tweens and their teens. So it's life changing work that I do. And I initially I focused on working with parents of teenagers, but about a year ago, I realized that there's really this unique challenge um, when it comes to parenting tweens, because it's like the in between, right? The ages 8 to 12. And so they're not little kids anymore, but they're not quite teenagers. And so like how do parents deal with that? And I noticed that often parents struggle with a lot of these topics, right? Guilt, self-care, just neglecting that, right? These are all issues that they deal with. And so I just found this age group to be really fascinating. And I saw like this real need to help parents build up their confidence and also be able to connect with their tweens during this like really crucial developmental stage. And so I'm super excited to be here.
Yeah. Well, I imagine, right, like the topics around mental health are just starting to become more and more like open. And so I imagine a lot of parents these days who have kids that are in their tweens or their teens, they themselves probably experienced bullying and never really addressed the things that happened or had developed the skills or the tools, the coping mechanisms to kind of manage the aftermath of that. And so I can imagine them having difficulty like feeling confident and solid in their self-esteem themselves, and then now having to relate to their child and to figure out how they can help them navigate a very similar experience but in a different atmosphere, right? Because the world is very different now probably when some of these parents were children themselves. I think it's a great topic. So I think just to let the viewers know why we decided to talk about bullying is because one, bullying is something that probably affects almost everybody in the world. There's, low levels of bullying, people making fun of you. And I used to get made fun of for having a pointy nose, and I was called Pecker and I hated it. And like, that's obviously stuck with me. But then there's extreme levels of bullying and some serious things that can happen from that. But no matter what, this affects the status of our mental health from when we're young all the way into adulthood. So is October is National Bullying Prevention Month. And so we decided let's do a topic about it and how it relates to our mental health and how we could be navigating preventing it much better. So with that said, let's talk about really what bullying actually means and what does this like look like in reality. What do you think? Like what are your thoughts, since with kids at least you see it a lot in what you're doing in your therapy business?
Yeah, no, I see it all of the time. You know, when I think about bullying, I think about it from somebody using their power, right, to assert themselves, their control, like whether it's like physical or just like mental, verbal attacks, right? It's like to hurt or control or intimidate another person. And so it's usually not just like a one-time thing. It's usually
Yeah.
like a repetitive, targeted behavior. That's what I would think or say that bullying would be defined as. But in reality, right, bullying can take a lot of these different forms. So the physical, the mental, hitting, shoving, name calling, teasing, like excluding kids from or whoever from social settings. And just like the more and more of what we're seeing is this big, huge term, cyberbullying, right? Like this,
Yeah.
it's huge. And so, actually, I was doing a little bit of research just before this, just because, I love to be, in the know of like all of the statistics and whatnot. And I found this alarming statistic where it actually came from a report from the Centers for Disease Control, so the CDC, and
Mhm.
it found that bullying affects over 20% of students in the US. And especially with like this rise of social media, like there's no statistics right now for online bullying. I mean, here and there, right? There is a little bit of statistics, but because the internet is so new, when you think about it in terms of like statistically speaking, a lot of like bullying statistics have come over a multitude of many moons, right? Whereas with cyberbullying, it's only been this span of like 10 years or so. And so the statistics really just aren't there yet, but the emotional scars that bullying just presents just can last a lot longer than what, like, even after the incidents stop, right? So if
Right.
it's not addressed early on, then it has the, what's the word I'm kind of looking for? I lost my train of thought
Lasting
for a second.
effects.
Yeah, like it can have like lasting effects on, and that's exactly kind of what we're here to talk about today, right? Is the
Right.
lasting effects of children versus adults and how that happens.
Yeah. And so before we like kind of get into the lasting effects, I think it's important to note, right? Like I know you specifically work with tweens, but like anybody can be a bully and anybody can be bullied, right? So it can be any age range from young children to teens, tweens, young adults, and then well into adulthood, even older. Like, I mean, I'm 33, but I've seen some like bullying happen even from like the older generation, not necessarily towards me, but like towards each other and things like that. And I think that there just hasn't been enough open conversation around it and an understanding around how significantly it affects our like the narratives that we carry with us and then how that contributes to the status of our mental health. So I would say like with kids, what would you say is different when you look at bullying with tweens or teens compared to like adults? Like when I think of adults, I see, I mean, depending on the type of relationship you're in, there obviously can be physical bullying, which can borderline abuse. Same with like mental and verbal kind of like I would say nitpicking is not the right word, but like you're verbally putting down your partner, and I think that's like where the transition happens. As adults, we don't consider it bullying. We just say that it's abuse. I think that's kind of like where we shift a little bit. And then with tweens or younger kids, where like they don't know their boundaries yet. They don't know they're tiny little humans that have to be taught how to actually be nice beings. That's where it comes on a little more on the bullying side, and that that's my thought. What do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think when we talk about kids and bullying, it is often more direct, right?
Yeah.
So the like you had mentioned, the physical confrontations, name calling, being excluded from certain social groups or whatever that looks like, spreading rumors. But as we kind of transition into adulthood, bullying, and you said this perfectly, bullying just doesn't disappear, right? I mean, we see it all of the time. It just changes its form. And
Yeah.
so for adults, for instance, and I've definitely been the victim of adult bullying as well, but it's more subtle. but
Yeah.
it's like just as damaging, if not more damaging, right? Because you have to work through your past traumas as well. Otherwise they will turn into now traumas, right? And so for adults, like workplace bullying is huge. So like for
Yes.
instance, right, somebody can be gossiping or like undermining the work that you're doing, or even just like again excluding you from any sort of like social setting in a workplace. And so and honestly it affects us differently because our bodies as well, right, are a lot older. Don't like to admit that, but our bodies are older. And so there are a lot of ways that stress can be in the body, right? And so like problems like sleep issues, hypertension,
Anxiety,
a lot of anxiety. Yes, yeah.
social anxiety.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. And so if you have already had social anxiety from maybe the bullying that you experienced when you were a child, and then you go into adulthood and you say, for instance, are excluded from social setting, maybe not intentionally, right? But still, like, if that was your story all along of like, I was not included because of something that I lack, then you are always going to find that story wherever you go. And so when it happens, even if it isn't intentional, it can
Right.
be a big blow to your self esteem and just who you are. Just it can really bring down your worth.
Right. And then that contributes to the actions you take in your life, right? Like if you already have this, if you have this narrative that comes from past experiences, doesn't align, is not supportive of like who you want to be, but that narrative is going to feed maybe certain behaviors that you take because you feel uncomfortable or you want to avoid certain situations. You might not put yourself out there. You might not go try new things. You might not ask for that promotion or something that you're seeking at work. And so yeah, I think I love what you said about that. I think it hits the nail on the head. What do you think? I mean, I know there's a million and one reasons why bullying happens, but my understanding of when someone is doing something to another person to, right, because they're kind of, that's with the bullying and the abuse to put their power over somebody else. I often believe, and I don't want this to be misconstrued as an excuse, but most of the time it's because these people are experiencing pain themselves or they haven't learned how to manage their emotions. What would you say from what you've seen, like if just especially with like tweens, because I feel like this is where it all starts, and unless they don't learn different behaviors, this will continue into adulthood. So what do you see are some of the reasons that tweens and teens are engaging in bullying or you know that sort of behavior?
Yeah, yeah. So, I mean, at middle school, it is a whole different ball game, right? And that's exactly, you said it. It really is the beginning of that stage where children are figuring out that like it's not necessarily so when we talk about developmentally, right, we talk about like from like ages 6 to 8, about is when children are more like they think about the world in a more inward narcissistic type of way, right? They think about it like, if somebody yells at them, say for instance if their parents yell at them, it's like it's more about like what's wrong with me, why haven't I done this. It's very like a narcissist, psychologically and physiologically, it is like a very narcissistic type of behavior because it's like, how do I relate to the world? And how does
It's
the world
ego
relate to
based.
me? Right. Yeah. It's ego based. And so when we see these tweens specifically starting to bully and get into these types of behaviors, it usually is, okay, how do I fit in with the rest of the world? And if they see that that is, for whatever reason, whatever, if they have a friend and maybe it's one of their first friends and he has other friends and they're all in a group or something like that, and maybe they're making jokes, like it doesn't necessarily, I don't think it starts off right as like malicious, but I think it becomes malicious, right? When it's like, oh, I'm just joking around type of thing, or we're all just joking around, we're all just having fun, type of thing. And so I don't think that sometimes kids know that line and those boundaries. And it's up to
Yeah.
parents to really help them to understand what those boundaries have to be and how to
Yeah.
relate to others as well.
Yeah, I mean, gosh, middle school kids are mean. They're just mean, right? But if I get what you're saying, if they're tiny little humans learning to humans, so they don't know what the boundary and the line is. And if they're thinking about the world in terms of how can I fit in and how can I feel included, then they start to engage in behaviors that everyone else is engaging in, or that's learned from their parents. Because, right, if parents themselves don't know how to emotionally regulate, or they don't realize that some of their behaviors are bullying type behaviors and they think it's funny, that kid can take it on and think like, oh, this is how we interact with the world and how we have relationships. And then if there's no one there to correct those behaviors and they see that they get a positive response from some people, or it makes them feel better about themselves, right, because it's very ego based, then they'll continue to engage in it, and then it escalates from there. And so I get that. I think right, it's also hard when we're coming from generations of people who didn't know any better, right? So the whole point of TINAH is that we want to have open conversations to educate, empower, and destigmatize. But the older generation, this was an issue. Talking about mental health and mental wellness is an issue. Talking about being bullied, they were probably told by their parents, let's just say our parents were told by their parents, like, suck it up, like, punch the kid back and move on, or whatever, right? Like, there's no kind of sensitivity response to it in like the emotional response. And so I think, right, our parents did the best that they could with what they have. And so this isn't to blame an older generation, but if they don't know themselves how to set boundaries and how they're treating other people, or in response to how they feel about themselves, and then healthily emotionally express that, they're not going to be able to teach their kids that. And then that's good, that it's going to be a cycle that repeats, right? Like cyclical generational trauma issues, all of those things. And so I think that I think that it's great that our generation is now having conversations around these things, and we're calling the mean little middle schoolers out on their shit.
Yes, and it's different too as well, between boys and girls, especially in
Yeah.
middle school, right? Boys, right? They're just gonna deal with their problems by punching another kid. They're not gonna
Yeah.
do, they're not gonna like try to talk behind their back, or start rumors or whatever. Like they just operate a little bit differently. But it's kind of, it reminds me of like kind of Mean Girls vibes a little bit,
Hmm.
the movie Mean Girls. It's literally
Yeah.
exactly like that. But I noticed, like, just in my own experience, I actually remember the guys being way more harder on the girls and being super like just bullying the girls, at least when I was in school in like sixth and seventh grade. I always remember the guys like really like being ruthless and mean and just so awful.
Hmm.
And then the girls were just, we're all best friends, and you're super nice, and so I'm super nice to you. It wasn't like a bullying sort of thing up until high school, I think, because
Yeah.
I think that obviously girls faster than boys, right? This has been heavily
Yeah.
researched, but it's very interesting the way that bullying kind of happens for
Yeah.
boys versus girls. And so yeah, it's all very fascinating stuff.
When I think back to like middle school or junior high, yeah, if boys had issues, they would get physical about it. But I say, yeah, middle school, junior high, boys would be more verbally kind of bullying towards girls, which I think that sometimes falls under the concept of like, oh, he likes you, that's why he's being mean to you, which is like totally the wrong message that we should be telling anybody. Like, if you like someone, you're nice to them, you're not mean to them. And so I remember that in my younger years. Like, I do remember there was a girl that I knew, she was heavily bullied. It kind of, I think it like started by boys, and then like the girls piggybacked off of it because that was just the thing that people were doing. And then I would say, like, I don't remember my memory. And people who've listened to this podcast know my memory shit. I have quite a bit of trauma in my background. And so I just have like blocks of time that are not really there for me. But from what I do, I don't know if I really was bullied ever in like middle school or junior high, but I do remember in high school, it would mainly be from other girls. And it was always more of like the gossiping and the whispers and like spreading rumors and stories that were, they were just mean, not accurate because for whatever reason. And I think, you know, like I think about it now and some of it sticks with me, but also I think about kids are just insecure. And I think, some kids, it's, it's done to make themselves feel better, which is a messed up way to do it. But I think that also comes from family structures then that probably didn't teach them, right, this is how you feel good about yourself. Like not just to be like, how do you communicate your thoughts and your feelings, but like encourage them to feel good about themselves, right? If you're not getting that at home, if you're not having like confidence instilled into you, if you're not, your parents aren't really trying to boost your self-esteem or show you how you can boost your self-esteem and take care of your inner needs, you're going to end up trying to find that elsewhere, and sometimes in the wrong way through something like bullying.
Absolutely. And there, I think as well, I can remember one time, actually, I think it was, so I was in fifth grade, so a little bit before middle school, depending on how your middle
Mhm.
school is like. Actually, I know some kids transition from middle school at fifth grade, but
Yeah.
well, I was still in elementary school. And so I remember I had a teacher and I was being bullied by, this specific guy and a group of his friends. And I remember saying, like, after a while, like, of course I would like stuff it down, or like ignore it, because it was like, I had a lot of friends elsewhere, so it didn't really bother me as far as that goes. But I was like, but all the adults around me kind of were like, if this is happening, like, you should tell a teacher and have them kind of whatever, have a resolve or whatever. However, I never got to know because it never happened. But that's, what was the expectation, or what we were told, that was going to happen if we told a teacher. And so I told the teacher, and I remember her reaction to this very day. She was like, "Oh no, I don't believe that. He's such a nice kid and he's so wonderful and da 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 da." And I just, like, after that, I really didn't have trust in the adults around me to
Yeah.
really have my back or to be there for me. And so what that actually did, and come to find out, this poor kid at the time was going through, his parents were going through like a messy divorce, I guess, and like the custody agreements and everything like that were like, he was having to go to court and all of these, very adult things that he was having to deal with as a child, and being stuck in the
Mhm.
middle of all of that turmoil. It was, I obviously now, right? Like, if hindsight is 2020, like, I understand why he was doing that and why he was so ruthlessly mean before,
Right.
with me. But at the same time, I also think about this teacher, and I'm like, I wonder if she kind of was a little bit like, because I know he's going through a lot, maybe I'm going to think the best things about him, or a positive thing. And on the other hand too, as well, mental health was not talked about when I was growing up like that. You did not have like emotional problems. If you had emotional problems, it was like, kids should be seen, not heard. Like, that
Yeah.
was the over um whelming kind of response that you would get from adults. It would either be like, sit down, shut up. If you're going through something, oh well, like, hope you survive, type of thing. And it's like, nowadays, it's like, when I was younger, I felt like I wasn't prepared for those types of things, and I didn't have that high self-esteem. And what that did for me specifically is that, really, for a long, long time, it really hurt my ability to be compassionate with myself, and to have some of those like perfectionist type of this perfectionist type of mentality, where, okay, I know that I'm not perfect, and I know, most every single person in the entire world is not perfect either, right? But So like it's like you can know something logically, but emotionally you can't step into that place without stepping into that perfectionist part of you, where it's it kind of almost keeps you safe. Like if I'm this person, if I'm do this like good enough,
Yeah,
then people will like me, or people will want to be my friend, or people won't bully me, type of
right.
situation. And so that definitely manifested in my life for like many, many years.
Yeah. No, I mean, this is a great segue because I was going to ask, like, how does bullying in younger years end up manifesting in later years? I can relate to a lot to what you're saying because I think about now I'm my worst bully, right? My internal narratives, like, which I try not to be, but I catch myself sometimes when I'm like speaking unkindly about my body or whatever is happening in my life at that moment. But I think, right? I think when there's a precedent that's set at a younger age where we have this horrible experience, it's we're not supported by the adults around us, or we're not heard by the adults around us. We're not taught how to process the experience that's happening, and we don't get closure to the situation. That builds into a narrative that we carry forward with us. And it affects our confidence. It affects our self-esteem. Have developed like kind of perfectionist tendencies. I've worked really hard the last few years to break that, but like definitely there's this need to, I have to perform, I have to do if I'm going to be seen as a success, if I am going to, be viewed as someone who can people want in their inner circle, who want to interact and be a friend of mine kind of deal. And so what would you say, like, you've seen some of the developments of people who've experienced this sort of bullying? How does it often like manifest later on in life outside of just the perfectionist things and like the low self-esteem?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of different, like I think we talked about it in the beginning a little bit, but having a tough time with boundaries, right? That's a huge one,
Yeah.
because you tend to get codependent on people, right?
Hmm.
The people that do, treat you with that respect. And so they develop fears of confrontation. They're
Yeah.
so fearful of, someone saying something against them, that it literally, when someone says one thing, they're like, wait, what do you mean? But they're
Hmm.
not saying it in out loud. They're saying it in their heads to themselves. And I think social anxiety is another huge one. I mean, if I can't even tell you how many times that people that I hear, people even on the Instagram, they're like, oh, I can talk to my audience and do all of the things, but I'm actually really an introvert and I have such social anxiety. It's like, a lot of people hide all of these different issues, right? And obviously, like, from a social media standpoint, right? Instagram, TikTok, all of those things, they're all they are is like a highlight reel of like someone's
Right.
most wonderful accomplishments. They're not gonna, someone's not gonna go to school and, be videoing someone bullying someone and put it on the internet and be like, look, you guys, like,
Right.
help me go viral,
Right. Yeah. Right.
or whatever. And so that's one thing that I think that people just are affected, and how bullying affects different
Hmm.
people. I think, people have issues of depression, PTSD, right? Like
Yeah.
that's a huge one. Having that PTSD from bullying can manifest all of these different issues in your life. Things that, maybe you have like a issue with, I don't know, like being confident, right? Like being
Right.
confident in what you're talking about. And that
Yeah.
manifests in that way.
Yeah, and then that all everything that you said on top of what I said all kind of steams down to you start to see issues in relationships. Maybe people struggle to form intimate relationships and so they haven't been able to find their person, or they in their adulthood have very limited amount of friends, or at work they're not able to like move up or do the things that they want to do in their industry, in their field. So it really can have like a serious trickle effect. At the end of the day, guys, if you've experienced bullying, even if it was years and years ago, but it's something you still think about, or maybe you don't think about, but if you can start to identify potential behaviors that you have now that might be because of that, it might be worth talking to somebody about. Like it might be worth getting some more self awareness around it and identifying where maybe you could start to change the narratives to better help you in your everyday life now because you are not the same person that you were when you were bullied. And if you are being bullied now, there are resources out there to find support to, like at least as adults to start to kind of have connections outside of that kind of close relationship where you're experiencing that. I'd be curious to know, because I don't have kids, right? And I don't, some of our listeners might have kids. How do you address this between like parents and their kids? Because when I think about it as a kid, I didn't want to tell my parents shit. Like I wasn't like going to go and be like, hey, this kid did this to me today at school. And so I imagine they're not very forthcoming with their experiences. And so how are you getting them to like bridge the gap between parent and the
I think most of the time, I mean, you kind of said it perfectly, really. Kids are not going to come up to you and be like, oh, so and so was mean to me today, and that's why I might be a little bit on edge. Like, they usually are not going to be that forward. It's kind of like, the sex conversation with your tween
Mm,
and your teens. Like, they're not going to come out and say, like, hey, so do you want to talk about sex with me or what? Like, they're not going
yeah.
to do that, you know? And so I think it really is up to parents to be proactive and always be, asking questions, wanting to have that conversation. And it doesn't necessarily have to be this like big, long 5 hour conversation where like you move mountains and like everybody understands everybody and whatever. It is always in those small steps, right? So like if
Yeah.
you're, for instance, if a kid is being bullied, for instance, and their parent wants to know how they're doing or what's been going on in their world, try just asking a question. Try literally just asking an open-ended question of like,
Hmm.
I generally don't like the how was your day, just because a lot of it
Yeah.
is very like, fine, yeah, it was good, blah, 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 blah. I like more directed conversations. So
Hmm.
a lot more of like, hey, like I know I see that you've been playing with your game. Why tell me about this game, right? Tell me
Yeah.
like what that, entails. And then actually allow them and listen to them about
Hmm.
whatever it is that they're interested in or whatever it is that they're doing, and then kind of use that as a segue of talking to them in a further and deeper way. And actually, I actually did an interview on my Instagram the other day with a sexpert, and she actually gave a really great strategy that I had never really considered before. And she called it the 2 Minute Tuesday or Thursday,
Okay.
whatever that you want. And essentially, it is our job, right, as parents, or it is parents' job in general, to educate their children around different topics, whether that includes
Mhm.
bullying, sex, all of those things. And whatever that is, it is up to parents to make sure that their children have that education. So using this idea of like 2 Minute Tuesday is like, hey, we're sitting down, maybe not across, from each other, right? Because can be a little bit awkward to talk about like bullying or sex or whatever, but maybe, catching them while they're in the car, like while they're buckled in and they can't move and
Can't
you're
go
not
anywhere.
right at them, type of thing. And having that conversation of, hey, this is when we're going to do our 2 Minute Tuesday. So I'm going to educate you about bullying, the effects of bullying. We don't have to talk about if you are being bullied or any of that stuff. You come to me and you tell me what you want to tell me, because that right there opens it up as like, this is something that I feel comfortable with coming to you as, and not necessarily as, if you're being bullied, you have to tell me and da 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 da. Because like, who would want that? I would never, like, for me, if an adult in my life at that time were to tell me that, I would literally be like, well, I'm not telling you anything, obviously, no, I'm really
Yeah.
not going to tell you. And so being able to create like this safe space and having and recreating it over and over and over again, even if they don't want to hear it, like, which is going to be true like 95% of the time, but they're listening. They are
Mhm.
listening to you. And they, even if you think that they're not, they are listening, and you are the role model that they're taking after. So they're looking to you to base their skill set. They're looking to you as a basis for their values and beliefs.
Mhm.
And for you as the parent, it's important. This is where the like crappy side of parenting comes in, because it's like you want to do so much for your children, right? You want to save them from pain, and you don't want them to ever hurt, and like all of these things. That's kind of almost where you have to take a step back and kind of understand from perspective, from a tween and teen perspective of where they are developmentally. The other, yeah, I'm sorry, I think we got a little bit, I don't know, can you hear me now? Awesome. So the other thing I think when we talk about emotional regulation specifically, one of the things that I love to do is I love to teach kids how to regulate their own emotions. And so one of the ways that we do that is something called the breathing box, or there's different names for it. I think there's like,
Square breathing, box breathing.
yeah. And there's some there it's like 1-3-1. There's some
Yep.
that's like 5-5-5 method, whatever. But the idea is that you focus on your breathing, right? It doesn't matter
Yeah.
about how long you do it, but focusing on your breathing is really, really helpful in regulating your own emotions about things. So, for instance, if kids are being bullied, and if you're taking that inward, one of the things that we can do to help our children educate them is to give them some of those emotional regulation strategies.
Well, I mean, you're hitting on all the topics we've talked about on Tina with like the breathing and like the emotional regulation and all of that. And I think this kind of it comes full circle to the point of our kids are going to mimic, we're the role models. They're going to mimic us. So if you yourself are working on managing, regulating your own emotions and processing your own experiences in a healthy way, and your kids see you doing that, they're going to they're going to follow suit. And I think like, right, so I do a lot of breath work. I'm big on breath work. I teach a lot of my clients on it because it's the first thing we do is nervous system management to like kind of get them a little bit regrounded for a moment. And I think, right, if your kid sees you every morning doing 5 minutes of square breathing, one, if they're like little, they're gonna be come over and they're gonna try to do breathing with you. And they might not be doing it right, but like they're gonna come over and do it with you. It's if they're gonna repeat what they see. If they see in the household you're being vulnerable, and again, like fine line here between parent and child, because you don't want to put your emotions on the child, but like, being vulnerable and saying, hey, I'm in a little bit of a bad mood. I had a really bad day. I had a not so great interaction with some people at work. I'm not feeling great. I need a little bit of space to kind of reground and recenter. And then I can come back to cooking dinner with you or helping you with your homework or whatever it is you need. I just need a few minutes, right? Whatever it is, but like you show your vulnerability, that's going to open up the window for them to be vulnerable back, right? I think you kind of like you really were spot on in saying it's not about being direct and saying, are you being bullied? But it's about setting the precedent, like having open and clear communication, demonstrating vulnerability, demonstrating coping mechanisms to deal with uncomfortable and difficult emotions, and making sure that you're educating your kids on how to do similar things, and then holding that safe space for them. But at the end of the day, it all comes down to being able to do that for yourself first, right? And so I think like it's just it becomes a generational negative feedback loop, right? Like parents from like an older generation, they might not have had the tools and things, or they don't do it themselves, and they're not in that process of self-healing and working on their themselves. And so then that kind of transfers over to the kid, and the kid might have issues, and if they're experiencing bullying and they don't learn how to properly deal or manage that, that's going to cycle on well into their adulthood. And then when they're adults and they have kids, it'll be the same thing, and it'll be over and over again. And I mean, I think this like ties it full circle for us of like why we're talking about this on Tina, because we're all about the self-healing journey, right? Don't get us wrong. We see There's a lot of value in getting support from your doctor, from a psychiatrist, from a therapist. Those things are definitely needed. People don't have to manage their mental health alone and on their own, but like you have to be a willing, conscientious participant in your own healing and managing of your mental health. And so that I'm sure listeners are sick of hearing me say it, but it's all about like that self-awareness and like being aware of where you're at and like what it is that how you're coping and how you're managing and then what you're putting forward to, for example, your kids and your environment. And then with kids, if they see adults, not even like in the family, I would say for me, I had a lot of trauma. So there was a lot of like bullying happening at home and things like that, and got really interested in resilience research. And one of the number one factors for a child being resilient in the face of any sort of hardship, one of the number one factors is having someone outside of the household be some sort of support or providing an alternative perspective to what their current world is. And so I think about there are very, very key people in my life I can look back to in like the fifth grade. I had to see a counselor because my parents were going through a nasty divorce, and she was like one and only experience at that time for me where she was really nice and like held space for me to just talk about whatever I wanted to talk about. And then I get these cool pencils at the end with these cool erasers. This is what I remember. But it stuck with me so hard that it was a perspective of this was an adult outside of my home that was treating me with respect, that was holding space for me to talk, and then not yelling at me after the fact, then not telling me to do something after the fact. I wasn't getting hit after the fact. So, like, it was just a nice alternative to what I was potentially like I was experiencing at home in different ways. And it made me see that, like, oh, okay, there's more to this world than what my small window is at the moment. And so I know I'm going a little off the rails here, but I think like, right, like any kid, any tween or teen that might be experiencing things, it's if we can show them how like we're being resilient and we're, there is value in valuing yourself and taking care of yourself and having a little bit of vulnerability and sharing that strength outwardly, I think could it's a huge benefit. So this is why we're coming full circle with it. Just with why we wanted to do the bullying conversation on Tina.
Yes, and I absolutely love that because all throughout what you were saying, there's this underlying word that kept on coming back up for me, and it was validation, right?
Yeah,
Validation is about, and especially with your personal story, right? Validate, at the end of the day, yes, she was a trusted adult, and yes, she gave you something different than what you had, right? So you look to her to kind of like model certain
yeah,
behavior. And underlying as well, she validated your experience, right? She
yeah,
validated and acknowledged what you were going through, and she actually affirmed your feelings. And
yeah,
so, the key for adults in situations where they have been bullied and they have, like, you were talking about, being able to have the self awareness at first and then being able to kind of heal that part of yourself. I always think about it from a perspective, like in my own personal story. One of the like kind of like stories that I always played up in my head because for so long I wasn't really able. I grew up with four boys essentially. I was the only
oh wow,
girl. It was, and that's just a little bit of the like sibling bullying, not just,
yeah,
actual kids in school bullying. And one of the things that I always had to do was like yell to get my feelings across. I always had to, was never validated in any of the feelings that I was having, right? And, by no fault, right, of my parents or whatever, it's not like they, at this point in time, they knew what validation was, right? Because if you're
right,
not validated when you're a kid, there ain't no way that my parents are going to validate me, right? And
right,
so this idea, right, that this is so generational when it comes down to emotional regulation specifically. I mean, it's huge. And now, I mean, I have it on my wall. Like right now, I'm like staring at it essentially because I had to write on this post it that like your voice deserves to be heard and you matter. People want
Yeah.
to hear you. And so I literally have that in like big, huge letters on my wall sitting right here because I had to relearn how to validate myself. And
Yeah.
that is the biggest gift that you can give to yourself, especially as someone who has been bullied in the past. It's just such a big, like, you don't have to have anyone else to validate you. You validate
Yeah.
you. Like, you
Yeah.
validate your feelings. And yes, of course, you have support people, right? Like, of course, you
Mhm.
have, like, and my husband, of course, he, like, well, maybe not all of my feelings, but he would validate my feelings, right? And that really gives me a lot of self esteem, confidence, all of that. But I
Yeah.
really had to learn and really had to learn to be compassionate with myself. And
Yeah.
it was just like this situation, right? I know, you raised your hand and whatnot, but I have a personal story, and this might not be the right place to like have it and to
Mhm.
tell this story. The way that this specific situation, and this goes along with that validation. So hold
Mhm.
on.
Yeah.
I had this situation where all throughout like kindergarten through sixth grade, me and this girl were like really great friends. Like we were best friends. And then in like half of sixth grade, I had to move to like a different school for a little bit. And then I moved back to that school. And so in that time period of where I wasn't there, this girl got new friends and all of the things. And so when I went back, fully expecting us to be friends, she obviously, had moved on with other people. And that wasn't the worst of it at all. I remember one day specifically going to sit with her at lunch, and like we had always done for our whole childhood essentially. And she had a bunch of friends, and I was a little bit quiet because I was like, I didn't know them. I only knew her. And so I was just trying to like get the lay of the land and, kind of communicate with them as much as I possibly could. And I went up to I remember leaving my lunch there and I went up to get like, I don't know, one of those forks or sporks or whatever those things are to like eat my ice cream. They gave it like they would give us ice cream or something like for our lunches during the day. And so I came back and started eat it, whatever, and all of the things. And then all the other girls like got up and like at the same time, essentially, including my friend. And she essentially laughed at me and said, I don't know if you know what you're eating right now, but it's hilarious. And I said, what do like, what do you mean? And apparently, one of the girls had spit in my ice cream and they thought it was all like funny or whatever. And for me, it was like this situation where I had thought that somebody was my friend and they obviously weren't. And from a
Yeah.
perspective of being in sixth grade, right, and not really having the tools that I needed, to either speak up or to do the things that I needed to do to like deal with this, I didn't tell anybody. And I just kind of like really I felt really alone. And so it shaped how I saw myself for a really long time. Like
Yeah.
not that specific situation only, there was more, but like
Mhm.
it was just like this overall feeling of like not being good enough, like not being good enough to be your friend anymore. And so it just like really affected my confidence and just how I approached relationships in general. I
Yeah.
approached them with with a lot of
Caution.
perception and caution. And so it took a lot
Yeah.
of work for me to kind of develop that sense of self and that self-esteem and that knowledge and being validated in the
Yeah.
things that I validated myself in, not other people. So that was just like a really kind of powerful story in my background that kind of really shaped me into being this, self compassionate, really aware person.
Well, first and foremost, sorry that happened. And thank you so much for sharing it because it is a really personal story. And I know we all have those. And so it's always helpful. I think it's helpful to hear other people's stories, to know that we're not alone in our own things. And so thank you so much for sharing that. And I really, when I had raised my hand before, I really like what you said about validating yourself. And if we could keep talking, I could keep talking for another like 2 hours about this, but unfortunately we do have to wrap up. So this is what I've been asking our guests, and I think this is a great point because you said you had to work really hard to validate yourself. So what are your three, or have been your three go-to practices or coping mechanisms that you've used to work on validating yourself despite your experiences and everything? What would you give, like three concrete actions you've practiced and done for yourself that maybe our listeners could lean into and use for themselves?
Honestly, I have really kind of developed my leadership skills. And I know you'll love that one because I know that
I love
you
it.
work in it. I've really kind of developed my leadership skills, and the way that I have is by pushing myself into doing things that are really uncomfortable for me, because I feel like in the uncomfort I grow. And so, I mean, and we all grow obviously, but like in the
Yeah.
uncomfort, I really like grow in that area. And so I just, for me, like thinking of myself as a leader, being able to be confident in that has kind of really changed the way that I operate my life.
Yeah.
And so what I would say in that area, because like, obviously you had asked for strategy more, or like what I do rather than like that. But I think just pushing myself into doing things that I don't want to do. So, being, for me at least as an entrepreneur, being visible on social media for me is a really huge thing, because I'm really freaking sensitive. If somebody says like, if somebody has a bad comment or something or whatever, definitely will sting me a little bit more, I think, than maybe other people who or will have this like strong type of skin. And
Yeah.
so me just doing that and being in that practice has really helped me.
No, I love that. And you did say earlier you've written down certain statements to remind yourself. So I think the combination of those two things, right? Like getting out of your comfort zone and doing things that don't feel comfortable, and then with the reminders that you need to give yourself, having them written down and visible for you. Those are two really solid practices. Do you have a third that you would say, like anything you've done to help yourself in the validation process, or even like regulate your emotions as you're trying to, like, push yourself out of your comfort zone?
Definitely self-care, I will say. So I really lean into self-care a lot.
Pick one form of self-care that you would recommend.
So this is kind of funny to me, and my husband would probably say like he hates this about me because he's completely different in that way.
Hmm.
I find that self care for me is like sitting down on the couch watching like I don't know, like a reality TV show where I literally don't have to think about anything whatsoever and
Yeah.
just get out of my head for, whatever, an hour, 2 hours, whatever that looks like, and just enjoying the moment, being in that present moment. That
Yeah.
really, that tool right there has really really helped me to just be more compassionate with myself.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. And I'm with you on the reality shows, but I got my boyfriend onto it and he loves them now too. And so we sit there and kind of talk shit about it. And so I'm with you on that. But I love that. I really appreciate you sharing your top three with our listeners, and sharing your stories and bringing your expertise and your background into the conversation. So thank you so much for joining us today. As you guys know, we'll have show notes with information, and then we're looking forward to seeing you guys in the next episode. So thank you so much, Crystal. We'll see you next time.
Thank you so much for having me.
There you go.
Yay.
Just so you know, thanks for listening to today's episode of the TINAH Talks podcast. Don't forget to hit subscribe. And if you love what we're talking about and are ready to start changing your life through your own healing journey, follow us on our socials at Time Is Not a Healer.
The TINAH Mental Wellbeing Marketplace is now live and ready to help you take control of your mental health. Head over to timeisnotahealer.com, where we'll provide you with the best toolkit for your self-healing journey.
All of the details can be found in the episode description below. Remember, you hold the power to heal. Until next time, you've got this.